about what next going forward, right? So it's great to have this chance to have kind of a cross-sector, cross-department, cross-organizational beginning of a dialogue. It'll be less of a dialogue than I usually hope. But there's a lot of stuff to kind of expose you to say, oh, I didn't know you were doing that. And that this piece is connected as well. I want to also say that this work is possible from my awareness because of Michaela Renz-Whitmore writing a grant proposal to the FTA that resulted in Albuquerque winning this TOD planning grant, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, a lot of connections. Okay, so transit-oriented development planning, the Central Corridor, what have we done, what's next, and how do we implement? David touched on some background. You know, I point out some of this stuff because it all seems to be brought to bear at the work in Albuquerque, right? So after being a naval officer and getting an international peace studies degree, which is a little bit of a conflict there, I founded the national program on sustainable development at a foundation called the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread, right? And this is about a couple years after the Rio Earth Summit when people were talking about sustainable development and experimenting all around the world and then all around the United States. And we brought people together instead of making grants. We brought them together for these 3-day strategic sessions, the sort of first round of American innovators in sustainable development. Some of those folks are actually involved in the TOD planning grant, and I'll point that out. So this work kind of goes back a long way. The Menominee Valley redevelopment in Milwaukee, the rail yards, was an attempt to bring sustainable development to a real place. And so this work is also an attempt to bring a lot of this stuff into a place-based focus. And what we found in Milwaukee was that when you focus on place, it's really easy to pull other stuff in to make connections. And then, you know, worked in a lot of city halls. And before coming here, I worked at Living Cities. The City Alive work is an offshoot of that. And in 9 other cities on how do cities organize themselves to achieve big, audacious goals. And you're going to hear about a big, audacious goals set of them that we have. So why don't we talk a little bit about what we've done in the last 18 months, because we're thinking about what to do in the next 6, and then think about implementation, right? So we've learned a lot. You've been part of pieces of this. Let's see what that looks like in detail, the highlights of what we learned, right? First, we did a bunch of analyses. The Center for Neighborhood Technology, Scott Bernstein founded it in Chicago. They're an environmental and innovation organization working on equity for about 35 years. What we learned from their analysis was that economic growth in Albuquerque is not reducing poverty. In fact, it's getting worse. The idea of housing and transportation, that I'll talk about a little more, was central to thinking about how we can make a difference in poverty, but also how we can use the art and the transit system in new ways to really bring about economic opportunity. So Center for Neighborhood Technology, they looked at property values in the last 10 years, and they found that value is holding, maintaining mostly in our corridors. As those of you working on the comp plan and IDO, centers and corridors, corridors are working for us. But we also had lower than average American growth over that period of time. So in a situation of low growth, how do we bring about more economic opportunity? It's a challenge. And as I mentioned, $4 billion growth in the economy in the last 5 years, but 19,000 more people in poverty. So we've got to find ways to link the economic growth to individuals to change that. The housing plus transportation idea, this is a little complex, but I'm going to go through those 3 diagrams. If you ask the question, where does a median income family, where can they afford to live in Albuquerque? It's in the top box in yellow. So pretty good, right? Most areas, by conventional definitions of HUD, are affordable. But if you ask that question, where can a family afford, so the official data tell us top diagram is affordable. But if we look at the second cost that households deal with after housing, the largest cost is transportation. Our official data right now only looks at housing costs. When you look at housing and transportation together, affordability shrinks in the middle diagram, right? So we are less affordable than we think. We are less affordable than the data we use to measure affordability. So that's that idea of housing plus transportation costs. When you think about 80% AMI or less, it almost vanishes. In the bottom diagram, that's what's affordable considering housing and transportation costs at 80% AMI. So working poor, low income, and very low income, HUD's classifications, it's very bad. But what the pattern shows us is that along the central corridor is the most location efficient places, right? Many of them. So we want to turn this into an asset and a tool. So how do we use location efficiency as a way to bring value to households? The second analysis that really helped us think differently was Joe Minicozy and Urban 3. They've done about 40 analyses around the country, and the same patterns have emerged in every American city. What you're seeing here is the value per acre of every property in the county, and this is a visualization of that analysis. The higher the bar, the higher the return on investment, right? And the colors, the purple is the most intense, the green is pretty intense, and the gray is kind of meh. And so you can see that the central corridor is, from a land productivity standpoint, our most valuable taxable acreage, right? And that was really helpful to think about, okay, if we want to grow the tax base, it's about location and it's about form. We'll talk more about that. John Anderson, until recently, used to live a few blocks from here. His wife is going to grad school, so he moved. But he's a leader on this thing called incremental development in the country. The idea of the missing middle of housing, right? The duplexes, the tris, the quads, the courtyard apartments. The kinds of housing that we have in our traditional neighborhoods all over the place, but over time, in some places, have become illegal, right? But what he helped us do with the IDO was to convene a session in the conference center, at the convention center, where we had interdisciplinary teams, a neighborhood activist, a developer, the evil developer, planning staff, right? And the charge was, all of you have one pro forma, make it work. And what people started to realize across those silos or across those divisions was, oh, you don't have enough money in the pro forma to give me the community benefits that I'm advocating for. Oh, regulations are actually costing more money to implement and making some projects not ever happen. So the pro formas didn't pencil. So when we learned those things, we were feeding them back into the IDO and calibrating our IDO to the conditions of demand and how to make projects work. So we'll say more about incremental development as well, because we are training incremental developers in Albuquerque as part of the strategies as well. Michael Pride, professor at UNM, looked at the social determinants of health. And this is a map that shows where you are born has more of effect on your health than whether you smoke or not, right? So this is morbidity or mortality by zip code, right? If this is true, and it is, it has profound effects on what we want to be doing as far as development, redevelopment, investment, et cetera, right? How do you operationalize that? This is a pretty new field and pretty new approach. We need to start working this into how we do the work in the places we're working. So these disparities in health, what can the built environment do about that? A lot, actually. And then the final analysis that's worth mentioning is Zonar. It's a software package that digitized the zoning code, at that point the draft zoning code, and it helped us look at the projections of what's possible in the central corridor, right? So this is not a design exercise, it's a volume exercise. This is the highest and best use according to the IDO on these properties. Much better than the vacancy or the single story or the low density development, right? And so as we think about what's possible in the central corridor and we combine these analyses, we're trying to figure out how to get the most out of this most productive land. So if you mash all that up, you get what's achievable. And what we've identified as possible is $2 billion worth of new investment in the central corridor. And by that I mean the dotted line, everything within walking distance of Central, right? So 12,000 acres. The redevelopment rail yard project in Milwaukee was 1,200 acres, right? So this is 10 times that. This is 10 times the size of Central Park. You could also save households a collective $1 billion, primarily through access to transit and the savings on that T side of their household budget. 9,000 jobs with the development that would come, about 6,000 office and tech, and 3,000 restaurant and retail, right? And 25% poverty reduction. So this is profound. This is that big, hairy, audacious goal that Living Cities was trying to help cities articulate for themselves and achieve, and organize themselves internally and externally with partners because, I mean, you can say, those are pretty ambitious numbers, but we think they're possible given all the research that we've done. So transit-oriented development is really a place-based strategy that says, concentrate all you got into that target area. Now, I used to be a naval officer, and this is very familiar, right? You know, you say, target it all there, right? All your tools, deploy them. Make little Minicozy mountains, right? Those little spikes in every station area, right? Our downtown in the spike diagram, but we can have that sort of centers and quarters. In those centers, around those stations, we can have the same kind of effect. We're going to design for people, not cars. And I'll talk a lot more about that in different ways, but you guys also know a lot about that. And then use the tools of local government. We're going to look at some things like location efficiency that people didn't even know about probably, and didn't think of as tools. So we're going to use some stuff in different ways. So TOD tools are the tools of government. We've got regulation and approvals, right? The idea being, as much as possible in the central corridor, let's reduce the barriers to investment, right? Let's make it easier to invest here than anywhere else in the region, right? There's a lot of other inequities in competition in the region, subsidies, you know, perceptions, whatever. Let's make it easier than anywhere else. How can we do that? And then let's also align our government policies, practices, and investments, right? There are lots of examples that we've encountered in the last year and a half of policies conflicting, right? We can't afford anything but alignment toward, you know, not competition with our policies and our practices, but alignment. And then do both to concentrate the development in these station areas. You've heard it, but this is the mantra, right? Is to strengthen and grow more walkable, transit-served, mixed income, diverse, connected urban places. This is, for lots of reasons, what we're aiming for and what we had in our traditional neighborhoods, right? So we have our own examples of where this has worked. It's called Old Town, it's called Downtown, and it's worked really well for several hundred years. So let's apply that back to our station areas. I mentioned the missing middle, and this is a spectrum. I don't know if you can see this, but you know, the housing industry has specialized into single-family detached homes, usually at scale of a development, or projects that are on the very right that have as many layers of financing as they do stories, right? Actually, probably more, right? So the Imperial Building, other mixture, right? So it takes as much brain damage to do either one of those as anything in the middle. So you can make more money at either end, and that's where the industry has specialized, right? What we don't have is the smaller duplexes, tries, courtyards, apartments that actual individuals could build, contract with a few other individuals, right? And so there's a lot of vacancy in our traditional neighborhoods. No one from the ends is going to go do that. So we are training incremental developers who know their neighborhoods, who are in their neighborhoods, to rebuild their neighborhoods in this missing middle form. We're also starting to discover, and this is a slide I haven't really worked through a lot. So Michelle Negretti, who many of you know, is looking at now the IDEO that we have and its effect on, beyond the John Anderson analysis, its effect on affordability and the ability to implement that missing middle. And so we're going to want to talk together in the next 6 months about what she's learning, but she's finding that there are some conflicts, right? And that might be limiting our housing choices. And at the same time, Family and Community is doing a 5-year consolidated planning process about how to spend our HUD affordable housing money. We need to understand the economics of housing and the regulation so that that plan can deploy the federal resources as effectively as possible. Where will they do it? What other barriers might there be in policy and regulation? And also the question is there such a thing as naturally occurring affordable housing? Can the market produce some level of housing that is affordable to 80% AMI or 50% AMI? It would help because the gap they're discovering is enormous. I forget the number. It's like 60,000 units is what we need, and we're producing something like 3,000 a year or something, right? So we need to work more on that and start talking. Another set of tools relates to the right-of-way, right? The public owns the roads, the sidewalks. These can be contributing to economic health, prosperity, income disparity. I will stand by this statement until someone can prove me wrong, but I would argue that road design has a greater impact economically on Albuquerque than all the money we spend on economic development. And gonna stand by that. So, I mean, look at it though. How we develop on the left, this two-story, compact, location efficient, high value per acre, buildings in Old Town, mixed use, walkable, transit serve, all these great things, right? Has been producing value for us for several hundred years. This is a purple spike on his graph, compared to, the stuff on the right that has a useful life of about 11 years, right? So this is the kind of stuff we want to have more of on the left. And
what's the hashtag?
Hashtag is what would Old Town do? A point about perspective. So roadway designers, transit engineers, in my experience, focus on the bottom two bands. That's their job. How does the system perform? What are the conditions that they need to measure? And what is the cost effectiveness? So when you get the BRT Gold Award, it's the bottom band. When FTA wants to give you money for a new start, they're going to look at the middle band, right? How many jobs accessibility, what's the change? These are definitely important, but the point is that they are fundamental for even more value to be created in the economic development side. So if we look at those system conditions and those measures as fundamental and foundational for economic development, we look at transit and roads as ways to create value, right? Which is not always something that we consider, or at least consider in enough detail. And that the quality of life and the livability is also achievable or contributed to by those. So we want, like the way we work with Lawrence in this TOD planning grant, we want transit, DMD, planning and economic development, community development to be talking together to figure out how to get the most value from all the bands. And I think a place-based approach helps us a little easier to do that. So we're looking to target the top. We'll talk about the public transit system. And I want to point out that the mayor already talks about it in more than just art, right? We are a little fixated on art these days. And it's a project. It is part of a bigger system. And so when the mayor talks about the BRT line on the University Avenue, right, that's going to connect the airport to Health Sciences Center and beyond, that's in all your long-range plans, he's starting to paint the picture of bigger than project, more of a system. The blue lines represent the highest frequency bus routes. And when people, as many of you know, especially Lawrence, we're talking about art, they're saying, well, what about the north-south connections? The next three lines that could have more frequency would be these in blue. And if you start to think of this as a system, there's a whole lot more of analyses that we could look at that show jobs access, the relationship of the transit system to jobs access, to poverty, and a whole bunch of things. But we rarely think of the transportation system as being able to affect those things. When we start to look at those diagrams and maps, we do. So again, removing barriers to transit ridership and looking at aligning policies and procedures, right? How do we get, there's a lot of things that you can imagine. Just because you build it doesn't mean it's going to be working and making the system, it's going to, the bottom two rungs are going to be achieved. But can people get to it? What's their experience? What's the user's experience of the fare structure, the passes, right? We need to look at how people interact with the gold system that we're building as a next step to make that more usable and to save households money, right? So there's more work to be done. And then the other idea that we're injecting to this is, can we try some tests? Rather than think of a great idea, spend a whole long time and a whole lot of people's energy to plan for it, and then a year later launch something with a lot of money, can we start little tests to question our assumptions about something would work? And we're going to introduce this notion of tests. Start small, fail fast, learn, and adapt. We looked at ridership because household value, cost of reduction is so important. We said, well, look, there's sort of three kinds of riderships. There's daily commutes. There's also the daily trips we take other than commuting, and special events. And the idea here is that There may be opportunities to do things differently. At the bottom is a gold pass, right? It's blank on the bottom, on the back. I could imagine, I would like to test whether putting an advertisement there to drive somebody to a destination, could they be induced to go somewhere if they had a coupon on the back? Or other partnerships that are possible with the business community. Who knows, but that's a blank space that we might be able to do something with. We developed a methodology with the department, ABQ Ride, and we're testing it now, but it's map where employees live, test how they consider the system. What are the barriers to them? What are the perceptual barriers? You know, like I gotta drive my kid, or I gotta be available to go pick my kid up from school if there's an emergency. These things that we're learning in the survey, and then we refine that into a pitch that addresses those barriers based on the data that we have from the employees, right? So we're perfecting that methodology, and then we'll implement it with our anchor institutions. Those anchors like eds and meds, you know, UNM, Pres. You know, the diagram there shows on the top everybody in an employee base who is within a quarter or a half mile of the transit system, right? Those are the folks we want to target. So through the employers and a partnership, we're able to get the data, we're able to get the employer to reach out to their potential customers. Not everybody, but targeting them. We also know that we want to interconnect, you know, I talked about the transit system. It's also about these different modes and the ease with which you can shift and move between them, right? I think we're able to gain a whole bunch more riders when they're able to have lower cost connections or other more convenient connections. So we want to look at over time how our transit system is even more interoperable with the other systems. I'll mention the car share idea too. So Dan and others, Tara, Urban ABQ had a citywide summit before the mayor took office, and 150 people came, and one of the ideas that had come out of that was a car share program in Albuquerque. A group of advocates and enthusiasts have been meeting now 3 or 4 times. There's work that is happening even as a result of some of these other connections, and there are willing partners. So that is another theme that we want to connect to. Vision 02, in our work we found that, look, there's money at the state to implement a Vision 0 program, and it's a big problem when you talk to people in communities, pedestrian deaths and safety. So these things relate to the transit and transportation system. We also think of land and buildings as tools, and the question would be, how many successes can we get out of the disposition of a public asset? How can these goals of 2 billion, 1 billion, 9,000 jobs be addressed? You know, somebody said that the biggest mistakes in a project are made in the first 5 minutes about how you think of what's possible. And so how could we turn that around and bring a bunch of folks together to brainstorm? How could this land asset help contribute to poverty reduction? Probably not a question that we ask every time, but as we work together with interdisciplinary folks like that are in the room today, could we bring that kind of diverse brain power early on and think about how much more can one project, how many problems can a solution address simultaneously? And that comes by working together. The diagram shows, well, the notion is also about financing, right? So you're going to create value. We talk about TIFs. There are other financing sources around the country, in Washington, at least for now, like TIFIA, right? And TIFIA is, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's basically, we got some financing from the feds, not just for rolling stock, you know, but also for transit-oriented development. Chicago and others have been using it for the stuff in the station area, very creatively. And as economic developers know, it's always better to use other people's money when you're doing projects. There's not enough money to buy everything we need, right? We cannot fund out of departmental budgets or even capital budgets all that's going to be needed. So we've got to be even more creative about how to leverage these tools, financial tools. So what could this focused investment in these station areas look like in Albuquerque? We go back to Joe Minicozy and what he taught us in a public lecture here in Albuquerque, which was a city is a farm. The buildings are our crops. The taxes are our harvest. And the central corridor is our most fertile field. So if you look at the tan buildings properties, right? those are, we got about a quarter of our 12,000 acres that are underutilized, right? Whether it be vacant, where the lot value is greater than the value of the building, whether it be single-story, low yield development. There's a lot of underutilized land in the central corridor. I think that 4,000 acres of underutilized land could house 160 Intels and Amazon HQ2s, if we did the math right. So if you look at just at the vacant land, there's a dramatic increase possible in the property that would contribute to tax revenue. We've got about a $30 million deficit right now. We can be taking more control over our tax base if we start to focus on just the underproducing land, the vacant land. It'd be about 10 to 12 million a year if the central corridor were built out forever, right? Like Old Town is producing value for our whole history. So what would it look like? It's a little daunting to realize that we would need this many buildings of this size every year for 10 years to get to the 2 billion number. So I look at that and get nervous if my job is to help implement this, but it also makes us think, look, we got to try hard. We got to be looking at tools that we never thought were tools. When there's a developer that wants to do something, we got to help them be able to realize their project, because we need 4 high-intensity buildings of 100,000 plus every year, right? We need, or some combination of these. But it asks the question, like, how much regional market share are we capturing in Central? If we make Central easier to develop than anywhere else in the region, could we capture that much? How can we attract more national investment to complement our good urban local investment, right? How do we work with institutions and their building programs, right? We really can leave no opportunity unaddressed. So if you look at the trajectory now, the sort of blue 45-degree angle is what C&T said we were doing in the last 10 years. So if we apply the growth rate of 3% that we've experienced in the last 10 years to the next 20, it would take about 20 plus to get to this goal, right? So the question is, how do you reduce that time? You can reduce it in green if you bring all these strategies to bear, right? And so we've got to try to go from, and then the little, sorry, I don't have a pointer, maybe I do, probably. But right now, there are a lot of projects that we talk about for 2 or 3 years at a time, right? We talk about Innovate, we talk about Titan, right? We've been talking about those since I've been here for 2.5 years. So in our minds, we're kind of counting all this stuff is happening, but it's really more than 1 year worth of projects, and we don't have that many more examples. So we're really not on a trajectory to make this goal. We've got to be able to execute faster and have more projects in the pipeline. And it's not just about a project, it's about the efficiency with which that project uses the land and the location of that land. So you can't see the labels here, but this is from the Minicozy study that talks about the Walmart at Nob Hill, the Coronado Mall, Old Town Cluster. There are different yields from different configurations of development for the value per acre. So we want to understand that better. And it's not just filling up that parcel that we talked about, right? It's filling it up in ways. Typically, 3-story buildings are the kind of thing that rock the ROI. So all that green stuff, it's 3-story buildings. So we want to think about the type of buildings that have mixed use, where it is located, will have a different yield than just square footage, right? So maybe that list of how many projects we need is a little less daunting if we get a smaller number of higher yield ones. So we need to understand that more. And then maybe we use Zonar to talk to property owners to say, hey, it's been a parking lot for the last 10 years. You could be making a lot more money if you develop to the new level that's entitled in the zone.